Hi, this is Paul. If you watch my videos, you might notice that I'm always a little fuzzy about exactly when and how I discovered Jordan Peterson. My best guess is that I first read about him on Rod Dreher's blog, but that might not be the case. At that point, before I was doing YouTube, I had a pretty well established rhythm of RSS feed readers, Feedly, things like that, and I was always just sort of looking for information that would feed me in many ways. I'm not going to make that mistake again with this guy. Hans-Georg Moeller, I don't know how to say his last name. We'll get to that at some point, I'm sure. But I wanted to record how I found him. It was Aron on Twitter, basically giving a link with myself, Jonathan Pajot, David of Revelable Wisdom, John Vervaeke, that I should check out this guy. And he had a conversation with Benjamin Boyce. So he's very much had the attention of this little corner of the internet. Now, so then I started taking a look at his videos, and I very quickly realized, there's going to be a lot here for me to look at, which is a little difficult because of my ADHD. I seldom really finish anything I start. So here we go again. Now, I was just yesterday, I saw this tweet about this podcast, which I didn't know about, of a joint podcast between Ricky Gervais and Sam Harris. But it isn't really about atheism, as people have been telling me. And so it just made me nostalgia. You know, where have all the good celebrity atheists gone? Remember the old days when in the wake of 9/11, Sam Harris was expressing his anti-Islamic anxieties and fears as anti-religious, and because there are so many silly Christians at hand, building a brand and a career about sort of debunking and doing all that was quite easy. And, well, that became Sam Harris. And Ricky Gervais, similar in some ways, and Ricky Gervais is he's a comic genius in many ways. And as someone said on Twitter, he's least funny when he talks about this kind of thing. And I did watch the first season of his little sitcom where he's a widower, and I really enjoyed a lot of it, and actually thought about making some videos back when I was watching it. I haven't watched the second season yet. But now we've sort of got to make do with what we've got for celebrity atheists. And so, snacking on Matt Dillahunty is sort of like eating generic Oreos. That's kind of the way it is. But, Rationality Rules keeps putting out Jordan Peterson videos. And so YouTube keeps, serving them up to me. And I keep watching them, and they get under my skin, and I want to talk about them. And then it's like, should I do a video about this stuff again? But I every time I sort of run that in my mind, I think, yeah, I should, because the arguments he puts out there, even though they're 20 years old and maybe Sam Harris did them better. Of course, Sam Harris and Rationality Rules are on different sides of the Protestant Reformation of the Church of Atheism, and Sam Harris is a Catholic, and Rationality Rules is an Anabaptist, let's say. So because that's all about the culture of woke, and so basically what's happened is that the civil war in the House of Rationality is all over woke or not woke, and what this means is that Sam Harris is now on with Shermer and many others on their IDW anti-woke crusade. This brings me all the way back to my conversation with Dr. Jim, the cardiologist from Idaho. I've had a number of conversations with. I haven't had any contact with Dr. Jim for a while. He might have moved on from my channel. It's sort of the way it goes with YouTube think channels. But he said to me, the rise of new atheism and the rise of Jordan Peterson is all about the death of modernity. And I don't know if he said it quite that way, but that's what I took away from it. I got to do a little grim grizz here and adjust my camera. And he was exactly right. And when he said that to me, lights started going on. And so what we see now is sort of the turn of A-level celebrity atheists. I remember, you can't even get some of these guys to talk about Christianity anymore because the anti-woke atheists are so ardent in their anti-woke campaigns, they find conservative Christians as their natural ally, whereas before conservative Christians were the enemy. Not so with Rationality Rules. We continue to be the enemy for Rationality Rules, and he continues to make videos like this. So call it decadent or call it what you will. But if he keeps making them, I'll keep watching them, and I'll keep getting annoyed by them and then wanting to do a response video. But there's a lot of competition in my salience hierarchy for stuff I'm going to make videos of. And I haven't really pulled one off yet for Rationality Rules. But again, I think those issues that he raises are important. And he's sort of riffing on the Stephen Fry, Jordan Peterson conversation that was a number of months ago that I'd done a commentary on a couple of months ago. So we'll see if he keeps putting them out. But again, those issues are very big in terms of Christian deconstruction. And so there are issues that I, as a pastor, do want to do some videos on. Christianity is deeply embedded in the Enlightenment, and the wokesters are now seen by the A-level celebrities, like celebrity atheists like Sam Harris, as a bigger threat to the Enlightenment than Christian fundamentalists. And I think, and that's what dawned on me a couple of days ago, that this is really an issue about the Enlightenment in some ways, in the same way that Protestants were anti-Catholic because we just needed to keep the fight of the Protestant Reformation going. And the Catholics were the enemy and the Pope was the Antichrist. And so we've just got to keep beating that drum. And so what is really the drum of new atheism? It really isn't Christianity. It's the Enlightenment. And so, this is part of how this is turning, and with the death of modernity and the dying of modernity and the dying of this form of rationality and rationalism, they're going to keep going on about this. But it's all heaven and earth stitching. So I've got another video coming out. I don't know about that. I'm going to have to post that video sequence. It's sort of a follow up to my commentary on the Keith. What was his last name? On the video about wokeism and transgenderism. So, and it's all about this register that, I'm more and more thinking about this. It's simply it's sort of a cognitive reduction of rationality, empiricism, heaven and earth, mind and matter, spirit and flesh. It's all of these dualities, this two mapping that we're simply not going to get away from by virtue of the structure of thought. And morality itself is impacted. The idea of morality itself can't help but be in the upper register, eternal, static. And it's in that video, the first video that Rationality Rules did, basically on moral relativism, that really sort of had me churning on this. And it came just at the time when I was thinking about these two registers in terms of the continual mapping of the two worlds mythology into our present day. And again, I think, the critique of the Keith Woods wokeism and transhumanism video. And again, I think the best articulation of this is actually in the Bible. And humanity is this, and a metaphor is from the story of Genesis. Humanity is the stuff of earth and the breath of God. Now, that isn't said exactly like that in the Bible, but that is the story of Adam's creation, where God made a man out of clay, and he breathed into him, and the man became a living nephesh. That is humanity. And I don't think there is any better articulation of humanity than what you find in the book of Genesis. Well, if I didn't believe that, why would I be a Christian? So that's the easiest way to say it too. I think it's the best sort of picture mapping of what a human being is. But technology is putting these slow-moving issues on steroids. And what's happening as increasingly we are not encountering human beings like we encounter them out on the street or in our families or face-to-face. We are encountering them in representation. Images, graven images. We encounter them in words, biography. We encounter them now on screens and on voices. And remember, this technology is today. This is brand new. Because if I were to ask you, let's say a detailed ask you for a detailed description of the difference between 1500 and 1600, well, there's just way too combinatorial explosiveness. There's just way too much information there for you to manage. But the introduction of the printing press in the West, the Columbian Exchange, the discovery of the Americas, the beginning of globalism, the Protestant Reformation, boom, 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 boom. All of this comes in the 16th century. And things have just been accelerating since. And things are continuing to accelerate. And so what Paul Vanderklay is, when I was doing my ContraPoints video on envy, and I knew when I kept calling her she, a bunch of people would say, no, he. And so you want to have this fight over pronouns. I totally understand that in this little community that sort of gathered around Jordan Peterson. But whoever or whatever Natalie Wynn was before she became Natalie Wynn, it's sort of like me talking about Tony Soprano. Andrew Klavan just dropped a really nice video on The Sopranos. It's sort of me talking about Tony Soprano instead of James Gandolfini. Because on television, in The Sopranos, James Gandolfini was Tony Soprano. I could talk about Geraldine and Flip Wilson. Geraldine, if you remember, now I'm dating myself, but there's a reason I'm going back to the 70s, because we're kind of revisiting the 70s in a lot of different ways these days. Geraldine was a character played by Flip Wilson, and if I'd talk about Geraldine, I would use a feminine pronoun. And you might say, oh, Paul's going woke. Good luck. Not according to the people who hate me. Been one in the comment section recently. It's been interesting. I always think it's a sign of health when I have someone in the comment section that hates me enough to show up in every video and leave, comments that express outrage at what I'm doing. I mean, if nobody is expressing outrage against my video, the video probably isn't worth watching. So that's just sort of the way it is. But all of this is about heaven and earth stitching. It's all about the breath of God and the stuff of earth and how these two things come together. Now, so the Rationality Rules video, the great myth, he very quickly starts talking about Kant. And every time he does this, it's like, gosh, my grasp on psychology is insufficient. And a good number of you know this. I'm not on psychology. Yeah, that's insufficient too. Misspeaking all the time on philosophy. I mean, I had a number of undergraduate courses in philosophy. I've read books. I enjoy it, but I don't have a degree in philosophy. I'm certainly not a philosopher, and I get stuff wrong about philosophy all the time. And I can name names of a lot of the people who have sent me things that you're just wrong about this in philosophy. And I take that partly because I'm not a theologian, but I do know a few things about theology because I have more training in theology and I have more training in biblical studies. When Jordan Peterson talks about meekness in the way he does it, he's just wrong. He might be correct psychologically in some ways, but he's wrong in terms of the linguistic tradition of what's happening in the Beatitudes. There's just a rightness and a wrongness about things, just like Jordan Peterson could have endless examples of things that I would get wrong in terms of psychology, because I've had even less training in psychology than I've had in philosophy. But, here I am on YouTube, and there you are listening to me. So I'm always having to relearn philosophy. And so I'm always trying to learn too much at once. I'm like a kid who can't get everything in his mouth at once, but has this insatiable appetite. Probably going to get diabetes someday. But so history of anything is never static. And what that means is if you're looking back, and this is because I actually have a degree in history, and that's the way history works. And it kind of gets into this question of personhood, because the Immanuel Kant of today is not the Immanuel Kant of 100 years ago. is not the historical Immanuel Kant. Well, who is the historical Immanuel Kant? We can't look back at Immanuel Kant, and now you're going to say, well, Paul sounds terribly postmodern. Well, the postmodernists have a point. The problem is, with almost every movement through history, someone overreaches with their point, which the most postmodernists have been doing. But how can we talk about the real Immanuel Kant? And so, after thinking about, I want to make a video on the Rationality rules great myth. I really want to make a video, but there's been so many other interesting things happening, and I haven't really it hasn't really gelled yet. And I'm always thinking about sequence of the videos that I drop, because there's certain things I want you to see, for those of you who watch all my videos, before I introduce some ideas, because I want to introduce ideas in one video and then that I'm going to start playing with in subsequent videos. So I have to kind of sequence the videos this way. But then something like the Mark Galley piece drops and it's like, oh, stop everything. This is huge. But part of it is because I've got all these irons in the fire. I've got a video that I'm going to release about a conversation I did about homelessness. I've got a conversation with Bern Powers that I'm going to release on my channel. I've got a really cool conversation with a guy from Greece about orthodoxy and my take on things, and that was cool. So I've got just way too much in the pipeline that any one person should post on any YouTube channel. I totally understand about the fact that in some ways I'm killing my channel with product. But my life is not my channel anyway, so I'm gonna put as much stuff through this channel as YouTube lets me. And at this point, they haven't said no. So here we go. So Rationality rules with his little video, The Great Myth, starts with Kant. And I think, okay, I got to brush up on Kant before I say anything stupidly wrong again, which I will do. And then along comes, and don't know quite how to say his name correctly yet, Hans-Georg Moeller. I would think probably it's a form of Mueller, but, it seems a pretty German name. And I'm watching his videos like, oh, yeah, this is doing a lot of scratching where I'm itching, baby. But then I also notice as I start watching multiple of his videos that he sort of daisy chains them, which kind of puts me in a problem, because it's like, am I going to do a commentary on every video he's released? Because he's released a few. So, and part of this is dealing with, with all due respect to all of my academic friends, you got stereotypes about pastors out there, and there's always a degree of truth to them. You academics, there's some commonality between all of you two. Now, Jordan Peterson is really an outlier. I mean, in many ways. But you can't look at an academic and just, the thing that they study is their baby. That's just how they are. But academics are not always great natural communicators. But this guy's pretty good. And some of the strengths of the Academy in terms of his presentation, his patience, his pacing, they're all quite good. And as anybody who's been to college or university knows, just because you get a PhD and you love a certain body of information doesn't mean you should stand in front of a classroom and talk. And often the sins of professorship and lecturing are compounded by YouTube. So, but, hey, John Vervaeke's a skillful communicator. There's no question about it. And I'm sure, he's a favorite professor at U of T. And part of it's just because he's such a lovely, genuine, loving person. And that shines through. Jordan Peterson is, of course, he's a phenomenon. He really is. This guy's good, though. This guy's good. He's using YouTube fairly well, which is also unusual for academics. So good on him. And so we're going to talk about his video. And I'm going to do a commentary on one of the whole videos on Kant's ethics. And I learned a ton from this video. It was really good, but it very much, I want to bring it sort of into my mental stream of consciousness and the flow of this channel probably because this is really going to be helpful in addressing a bunch of the celebrity atheist moves that Rationality Rules is continuing to make in his Viagra-fueled you-know-what about Christianity. So here we go. Sound level looks good. Here we go.
Thank you very much for your continued support of this channel. And today we're talking again about Kant, about Kant's ethics, because Kant's philosophy really consists of those two parts. The one,
Now, again, as I said, he sort of daisy chains his video, so you kind of have to start at the beginning and go from there, but I haven't done that yet. I don't know if I ever will, but at some point, everybody's life is sort of like that, and we can't rewind us all to the Garden of Eden, so let's go.
Analysis of pure reason, where he basically just gives an account of reason investigating itself. And then second part of his philosophy is a critique of practical reason, where he explains what can reason tell us practically, how to lead our life. He tries to answer the question, what are we supposed to do?
And again, he's already kind of leading us nicely into Kant, and you can tell that he's got some experience teaching people. And I'm also thinking about the fact that in some ways sort of this undergrad level has sort of become, at least for my channel, a nice place to at least begin conversations, just to cover some basic stuff.
Like the critique of pure reason, the critique of practical reason equally addresses this so-called scandal of philosophy, namely the fact that philosophy didn't transform itself into a reliable form of science.
Now, he's got I've watched a few of his other videos already, and he's got some really good stuff on this, and so I'm learning a ton from him in terms of, he has this other video that is the one I actually watched right after I watched this video, where he talks about dogma and religion versus philosophy, and he sort of nicely lays out there that especially in the Enlightenment, so we can go back to Jordan Peterson talking about Jung's observation that science, we should probably say science and technology, got going because Christian theology didn't give us all that we wanted. And so we turned alchemy into science, and now we have a degree of ability to give us the lives we've always wanted by, technology, working on it, just at all these different levels. And the frustration that philosophy hasn't turned out to be quite as handy and productive as physics and the children of physics, like chemistry and biology and engineering and inventions and all of these things. Philosophy hasn't turned out this way. Now for me, this two kind of the two worlds mythology, or the two different registers, as I've been calling it. And again, part of the reason I do what I do in these videos is I'm developing the language as I'm talking, because I find you can do it with writing too. And I find that back when I was blogging, before I was talking on YouTube, I would find the same dynamic when I'm writing, because I have this thought and I'm trying to say it. We can think of Ian McGilchrist and the two hemispheres. So these two registers, well, philosophy is very much the stuff of the upper register, of heaven, of mind, of spirit. And in some ways, and a lot of the other things, the physics, the biology, the chemistry, the engineering, they're things of the lower register. And by virtue of how every human being is, again, we are the breath of God and the stuff of earth. And we are the stitching and intertwining of those two things. And so, of course, we're going to find it easier to make advances quickly in the lower register. That's simply how the two registers are related. So, well, what's wrong with philosophy? Why can't we Why can't we whip this into shape the way we figured out the speed, Newtonian mechanics, and then the kinds of engineering that we can build upon Newtonian mechanics with? So
Kant also here very intentionally tries to develop a moral philosophy that basically serves as a moral science, as a moral metaphysics.
Now, this is where we get into, so Adam friended and Adam's obsession with objective morality. Because, okay, in the two registers, the question of what should we do? Say the thing about Jordan Peterson asking the question, if you need to get to the other side of a cornfield, how do you go through the cornfield? These are far bigger, more important consequential questions than just the question, the sort of mechanical means by which we traverse the cornfield. Because, well, is this field owned by Farmer Maggot? Little Tolkien reference for you there. Am I going to do damage to the crops that others have invested? I mean, because suddenly with this moral question, whole worlds come flooding in. And so part of what philosophy would love to do is come up with moral answers that are not dogmatic. And again, he has a wonderful video on definition of dogmatism, and I want to see, part of the problem is I'm liking so many of this dude's videos, there might be a lot of these commentaries. So I don't know if that's a problem or not, but here we have it. Hopefully he won't go to that little page in YouTube and say, there's this crazy Dutch Calvinist pastor who is, using my videos a ton, tell YouTube to shut Vanderklay up. If he talked to Benjamin Boyce, I'll maybe go through Benjamin Boyce and say, Paul's not a bad guy. Don't click on that button on YouTube. Don't you want your ideas to spread?
What he calls it. It serves as a moral science. Develop a moral philosophy that basically serves as a moral science.
And again, now this... See, I don't undermine your videos because nobody would get a sense of your video by listening to me. Because I totally hijack it. A moral science. Well, what do you mean? Well, that once you use that word science, and it's really technology, but once you use that word science, it sort of enlivens in us the hunger for mastery. If we can, and this is always so deeply human, and again, my Augustinian roots show here, suddenly our ambitions are just enlivened and we think, oh, if I can turn it into a science, then I can have dominion. Then I can not only master myself, which most of us are too blind to realize we have not mastered ourselves. Then I can not only master myself, but I can master the world. It's sort of, there's going to be maybe a few Tolkien references. This is going to be Sauron's vision of mastery.
As a moral philosophy that basically serves as a moral science, as a moral metaphysics. This is what he calls it. Interestingly, he says at the end of the Critique of Practical Reason, this is a very famous quote, that two things fill his mind with admiration and awe: the starry heavens above and the moral law within. And what this quote clearly...
Now, it's interesting that the moral law within, notice that there's a geography to this moral law. But again, and he knows full well, this moral law isn't something that's discovered when you do archaeology in Egypt or you do mining in Siberia. The moral law isn't that sort of thing. Where do we find it? We find it within. Now, this is going to get into his ideas of rationality. And of course, German idealism is going to come into play here. So there's a lot going on here. But the starry heavens above, well, there's geography for that. Starry heavens above, the moral law within. Again, these registers, these two world mappings, they aren't going anywhere.
Really shows is that the supposed moral law within is very much comparable, or is an analogy to the natural laws that govern the motions of the stars in the sky.
He said natural law. Carl, I do read your messages. Welcome back to the channel. Moral law. I know some of you just get moral law, moral law. I'm sorry, I shouldn't troll.
So govern the motions of the stars in the sky. So again, this underscores this attempt to do ethics in the form of a moral science. Just as a natural science, where we...
Now, the production values of this channel are not bad. I don't know if, again, my impression of most academics is they're not too good with the techie stuff. But I don't know if he's doing this or if he's got a student that's helping him, but good job.
We have to identify certain basic laws, for instance, in physics. Also in Kant's moral metaphysics, his primary aim is to identify the highest moral law, the highest principle. And that for him is the categorical imperative. So the categorical imperative is an unconditional commandment. It's the highest law that is based on no other laws but grounds all the other laws.
Okay, now this move that happens right here is really important. And this is part of what deism does to the Christian imaginary and the question of the movements around what I've called God number one and God number two. For those of you who haven't watched hundreds of videos of mine, and there are hundreds of them, those of you who are new to the channel, who have thought, well, if I really want to understand Paul's channel, I should back up and watch the first video and go from there. Don't do it. Don't do it. It's probably not worth it. Anyway, if you didn't start the train, you'll never catch up. Ask anybody who's ridden this train. Anyway, God number one and God number two. Where did that little thing come from? It came from me watching Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson talk. And I very quickly began to realize that at the end of their first talk in Vancouver with Brett Weinstein, that Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris's definition of the word God was very different. Sam Harris was very much riffing on the assumptions of who God was growing up in Southern California and watching American, probably evangelicals, talk about what God was. That's God number two. That's a relational God. It's an agentic God. It's a transcendent God. God number one is an immanent God. God as arena, as in the meta-divine realm, to look at Ezekiel Kaufman stuff. So again, it's a whole lot of repetition and summing up here with God number one and God number two. So the Christian God is God number one and number two together. Now, again, there's no God number three, because unless you want to go into Vervaekian transjective stuff. The agent arena relationship, God number one and God number two. The transcendent immanent, God number one, God number two. General revelation, special revelation, God number one, God number two. A whole bunch of different dualities sort of map onto this God number one and God number two stuff. And I know a bunch of you say, well, you got to stop using number one and number two because that's bad. That's what Adam says. But the reason I use number one and number two is because it's intentionally blank. And it's intentionally in some ways arbitrary. It's not exactly arbitrary, but it's intentionally so. So what happens in the history of deism is that in some ways the meta-divine realm gets reconstituted in a Christian space. And natural law, created order. We Dutch Calvinists say created order, not natural law. So when you hear me say created order, and when your heart really wants me to say natural law, just do the translation. It's okay. Imagine me any way you like. I'm about to do a ContraPoints video. Not really. This movement here to depersonalize, and this is why I talk about the scientific lab leak, because what happens is it's no longer God moving these spheres that Galileo is dropping from the observatory. It's gravity. So I have these laws of physics that sort of stand in place of God number one. And we feel a little bit more comfortable talking about that. Maybe because, well, did God drown Lisbon? The evolution of the problem of evil has been interesting over time. And it has a lot to do with these issues. So this move that's getting made by Kant to, well, we want to have a moral law which is just like how we imagine the laws of physics to be. We want to take the personal stuff out of it. And once we have that, but this is quintessential modernity, because part of the aspect of modernity is that the world is dead except for us. We are the ghost in the machine. We are the ones moving the levers. Now, again, the meaning crisis happens when we take this assumption and we begin to look in the mirror and we imagine, oh, we're having an AI moment. What if I am a machine? We have an iRobot moment. What if I am the machine as well? What if there's no me in here? What if there's no self in here? What if I am just mechanistic? And this gets into sort of a functional social solipsism, where I'm the only real agent and I have psychology and sociology to explain everyone else. And that's, again, this sort of this divination of the individual, that I am, and solipsism basically means I'm God and y'all are here for the ride. But the problem with me as God is that I'm an amnesiac, and I just have to realize that I am God. Now, there are certain religious traditions that basically do something like this, that what I really need to get in touch with is my godness. The God in me sees the God in you. Oh, well, I frankly like my God with a memory and with a lot more agency than I have. But one of the things that you notice is that the God in me sees the God in you, plus individualism leaves me alone as God. And all of you are sort of substandard things. But anyway, so back to modernity. This view of the world, and some of my first videos just came out of my mouth, this monarchical vision that I alone am God and I see the world as it is, and all of that. Well, that flows from modernity.
There are two famous formulations of this categorical imperative. Both are related to one another. The first one is act in such a way that the principles informing your actions are universalizable. So the principles that inform your actions are supposed to be principles that everyone can apply at any time.
Now, this is critical for the rationality rules stuff, because basically the argument that he uses, a la Stephen Fry and Jordan Peterson in The Greatest Myth, I think it's the title of the video, I don't remember, I don't have it in front of me, it doesn't really matter, is that, well, Christians say that that's what they get from the Bible. Now, Jacob, you know which Jacob I mean, because you're right now the only real Jacob in my life. When you talk about the Jewish law, I hear some of that. Now, there's a big question there about that I don't have any time to go into. But in some ways, that Rationality Rules video is much more addressing someone with a law conceptualization that here we have these 613 laws and they may not be broken and they apply universally everywhere we go. Now, obviously, to me, I don't want to say that that's what Judaism does, because I'm afraid that that's straw man's. Because I remember in seminary looking at Driver's commentary on Deuteronomy, him going, it's an old commentary. It's like, I think, did I buy a copy of it? I think I might have at some point. Oh, there it is. So I first found this commentary in the library at what was then Calvin College, a critical and exegetical commentary on Deuteronomy by the Reverend S.R. Driver, D.D., Edinburgh, George Street. Oh, my eyes aren't what they used to be. Well, this one's 1978, but the original one had to have been like 1912 or something. Anyway, I remember first bumping into this and reading it when I was working on a sermon on Deuteronomy, and he very nicely went through the differences between the laws in Exodus and Deuteronomy. They changed. It's a very old change. It's before we have any record of the changing. Now, here's the problem of my office. I just took this book down, and I'm going to lay it down on my foot because I'm lazy. No, I'm going to put it back on the shelf. I have plans for my office, and they might be coming to my video channel at some point soon. But what we're seeing here and what Kant wants to do is say, well, let's just like we've done with physics, like we have these constants, which again, what's his head noted that these constants change. Gravity is fluctuating. Speed of light is fluctuating. We wouldn't need a ministry of constants if the constants weren't constant. So what's going on in the universe? Anyway, we want moral laws to be like constants. And this is exactly what Kant comes up with, as this video really nicely articulates. Spoiler alert.
A second kind of variation of this is act in such a way that you never treat people merely as a means to an end, but always at the same time as an end.
Now, if you can't recognize Christianity in that, then you don't really know a lot about Christianity. And someone might say, well, that actually goes back to the beginning of Genesis, that we're made in the image of God. And that then creates a framing. And again, your religion is the thing you won't deconstruct. Your frame is the thing you won't deconstruct. You need a frame in order to see the world. You need at least some constant in order to watch the variability. Otherwise, you can't track anything. The camera needs to be still to take a picture of a moving image. Otherwise, camera shake and running gazelle will not make a good picture because a photograph is a still. Now, maybe you say, well, if you have image stabilization and a super fast shutter speed, yada, 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 you should get the point. And what I really liked about his presentation here, I should just play it because I plan on playing the whole thing and we're going to be here for hours.
In this short video, I'm not really going to outline how Kant arrives at the categorical imperative. Here it may just suffice to say that the categorical imperative is supposed to be grounded in pure reason. That is, it is not to be affected by any considerations either of pragmatic utilitarian value, nor by any considerations of what philosophers before him called moral sentiments. That is kind of an emotional understanding of what is right and wrong.
Now, when he said this the first time I watched it, I thought about C.S. Lewis in the beginning of The Problem of Pain, and basically Lewis's ideas of moral intuitions. And that maps onto a whole bunch of C.S. Lewis's ideas about that our moral intuitions, it's very Platonic, basically see through to the moral order that's out there. And of course, at the beginning of Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis bases his argument for the existence of God on sort of a moral order argument. But Adam Smith is a very interesting guy, and he, like many today, would want to sort of construct his moral universe up from things found in experience. And so the major point that Moeller is making here, Moeller. If you go back, you'll find all the trouble I had learning Jonathan Peugeot's name. So let's just call him Hans, or the good professor, or they didn't name the channel after him, so I don't know. HG, we'll call him. We'll call him HG. But the point here he's making is dead on right. So, in other words, for Kant, this has to be pure rationality. Rationality must rule, as it were.
Instead, just like a natural law, the moral law is found through rational deliberation. Then, and this is very important, Kant says we follow the law, or we ought to follow the law, merely because we understand that the law is right. And we understand, therefore, because of the rightness of that law, it is our duty to practice it.
Now, there's so much there, what he just said, that, well, there's this moral structure of the world, and it's our duty to follow it. Now, a contemporary skeptic would say, why? The law of the nation is that I only drive at such and such a speed, or I don't encroach on my neighbor's property, or I don't play music loud in my car and bother people who are trying to sleep, or you know, Lewis's observation that all of this law talk makes citizens out of matter. There's a lot weird going on here, and there's way more built into the language and its culture and its assumptions, as HG will point out as we get further and further in this video. This is a wonderful video. I really like this video. But this view of the world in many ways exemplifies exactly what modernity is about, because personhood is excluded, and personhood has to be excluded. This is the naturalism lab leak right here. That, well, this seems to work well for spheres to sort of cut God and agency and personhood out of the equation as we're dropping them from our tower in Italy, Mr. Galileo. So why don't we just exclude God from everything? And then, well, again, in modernity, this individual deistic solipsism, then I will reign. At least after we find psychology, because you're just the product of psychology and sociology and evolutionary psychology, and you're just a product of those things. But me, I'm free. Or maybe I'm not. Meaning crisis.
So this is what then Kant in German calls Pflicht, duty. So
glad he said that, because if I had read that word, P-F-L-I-C-H-T exclamation point, I would have definitely asked to buy a vowel.
For him, ethics is based on duty, and duty in turn is based on
his Prussian culture. There, I said it.
Understanding by purely rational means that which is the moral law. So, to a certain sense, this is very heartless because it deliberately excludes everything empirical, everything emotional, everything non-rational from these rational considerations about what is morally right. Kant therefore says that really
and he says it's heartless. I think he should probably say it's personless. There's no people in this thing. There could not be. People have to be reduced to things like he's been describing. I mean, in some ways, the meaning crisis is the telos of modernity. It can't be any other way. And again, what's all this talk about meaning crisis? Look at the work of John Vervaeke. It's excellent.
Morality has nothing to do with being kind or being nice. If you do what is right simply because you're a kind or nice person, then you're not really acting morally at all.
Now he's saying this because his audience needs for him to say it, which shows the contrast between Kant and the world that regular people live in today.
following or being nice. If you do what is right simply because you're a kind or nice person, then you're not really acting morally at all. You're just following some emotions, and you just, do what you naturally do because you're a nice person.
Now, here's part of the problem of rationality rules. This assumption about anthropology that he is speaking to right now, which is seldom described or deconstructed, which he's actually using Kant to deconstruct, this is pervasive. And it's all over the place. I gotta put my watch on Do Not Disturb.
So that, for Kant, doesn't have any moral value. It might be a nice thing, but it's not a moral thing. Morality for Kant solely consists in, through purely, that means non-empirical, purely rational considerations, understanding your duty and then acting out what your duty is.
Again, feels awfully Prussian. Anyway, you can see why this guy's a good professor. He knows his audience. He's speaking clearly. He's a lot more economic in his words than I am. And he's laying it out in a really good way. We're only 5 minutes into this video.
This metaphysical, scientific, rational approach towards morality is supposed to found something like moral metaphysics as moral science. And it comes with a certain, what we could call epistemological optimism, right? Just like in science, we can identify certain universally valid laws. So the idea is we can also do the same thing for social life.
And now part of how we know that modernity is dying is because we don't just see this, what he just very economically laid out, and say, we're now seeing ourselves watching this. Now, we're going through all this Kant stuff because a lot of the really good stuff that he is playing with in terms of what he's walking through now is just his undergraduate lecture of Introduction to Kant. When he gets playing about profile and identity and prophilicity, that word, prophilicity. When I started hearing that word, I had to pause and I had to think. And I thought, that is a crafty word. That is a crafty word because the icity is sort of like felicity, which is happiness. Prophilicity, I thought, how does the No, profiling. This is about in some ways the bliss of being nothing but a profile. The bliss of becoming your profile. This is getting into the secret, sacred self. And this is getting into becoming my avatars on the internet. We're going to get there. We're not going to get there in this video. But there will be links to this video, of course, down below. If you're not reading the notes on my videos, you're only getting half of the stuff. Not that I write anything special in my notes most of the time, but all the links are in there. So if you're a digger, dig down and watch these videos and get into his channel because there's a lot of good stuff in here.
So we can basically ground a future society on the
eschatology
and the ultimate discovery of these generally valid laws.
We can bring the kingdom of God on earth. There, I said it.
So philosophy is supposed to do exactly this job. It's supposed to be not only the foundation, as in the Critique of Pure Reason, for all the natural science, basically, but also for social science. Kant very explicitly insists on the absolute necessity, on the indispensable necessity of identifying these laws and of the validity of these laws. So these...
Now, when you say well, let's have him say it again.
Identifying these laws and of the validity of these laws. So these laws are valid with absolute necessity, and they are indispensable.
They're indispensable. It's like, wait, we got a lot of ought smuggling here, don't we? Mr. Prussian Immanuel Kant. Your German Prussian. Boy, I'm sounding like an... It's my Jewish genetics welling up in me. We're revisiting the 20th century right here in this little box. What's going on? Why is this indispensable? Well, because we must what? We must arrive at bliss. We must reach our potential. God's kingdom must come without God, because God can't be trusted. He's only telling you not to eat the fruit from that tree because he's withholding stuff from you. What you really want, Mr. and Mrs. Naked in the Garden, what you really want is to take matters into your own hands and make this world better than that guy who made the garden will only begrudgingly give to you if he has to. Maybe even then, not so much.
He says as much literally in the preface to the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals. Attached to this absolute necessity, or this indispensable necessity of the moral laws, are like four notions that I'd like to briefly address. These four notions are all central to the age of enlightenment, and thereby they're all connected to this idea of a metaphysical grounding of what is basically a scientific ethics as a form of philosophical moral science.
Okay, now, shoot, see, this is... So I listened to this whole video and I decided I'm going to do a commentary on this video today. And I had a few more minutes, and so YouTube served up another video of his which looked really good, and it started talking about all this stuff, and I started watching it, and it's in my head now. They're trying to replace religion because religion has failed. Well, what do you mean it's failed? Well, Luther said it's failed. The Roman Catholic Church has failed. And so Protestantism was supposed to fix what's in the Roman Catholic Church. And what we got was like the 30 Years' War and, wars within the Holy Roman Empire and the Luther and Zwingli couldn't agree, and the Anabaptists are doing crazy stuff until finally they learn nonviolence, and then we all sort of go and buy quilts and pies from them in Pennsylvania. We're trying to replace religion here, but our moral imagination has been infiltrated by Christianity at such deep levels we can't think of anything better.
So these four notions of enlightenment are, first of all, autonomy.
And I love what he does here. So these are four notions of enlightenment, sort of like four pillars of enlightenment, let's say. Autonomy. Well, it means, and again, now think about modernity. It's this deistic solipsism where I am the only true agent. And all of you, now this again comes quite a bit later. This has to be after the development of the social sciences, of economics, of psychology, of sociology, that all of you out there, sorry to let you know, my world and welcome to it. I'll cancel you if you get too annoying. Actually, I won't really. CK, who just is really outraged by me as a Christian minister and the kinds of positions I hold. Welcome to my channel. You're welcome here. I have no problem with you leaving the comments that you leave. In fact, they let me know that I'm doing a good job, so keep at it. But autonomy, that autonomy, oh, he's going to explain it. He explains it better than I do.
So what does autonomy mean? Autonomy, giving the Greek roots of the words, literally basically means self-law giving, auto being the Greek word for self and nomos being the Greek word for laws. Autonomy is a very strange notion which is
early 17th century. Did you know that? On the little, because I know, I get those little, I clip those little things from YouTube too. He's got someone editing his videos. My videos would look this good if I edited, I swear.
the second enlightenment idea of freedom. Because
the guy who makes the slides for church has this same picture that he's used from the internet for some of the songs in church. And every time I see this, I see the little chains that I made in grade school, taking construction paper and gluing them together and making a chain. There's another picture of autonomy or freedom like this that has like little clips that are photoshopped onto someone. So sorry, I digress, but if you don't like digression, you better find another YouTube channel.
Idea of freedom, because autonomy, of course, then does not mean that you can just do what you want. To the contrary, it indicates that you find out what the law is, the nomos, but you find it out yourself. And in addition,
isn't this beneath all of our modern education? Well, you need to figure this out for yourself. You need to think for yourself. So you'll see on one hand, it isn't just pure liberationism or libertarianism that I am totally free. No, I am free within a created order, natural law. I am free within this realm, and I should find out what this realm is like so that I can maximize my autonomy and my agency. And so right away, freedom is sort of curtailed.
To that, you not only find out yourself what the law is, but you also decide yourself to follow the law. So in this way, as Friedrich Engels later called it, we can understand Kant's notion of autonomy as a form of freedom consisting into the insight into that which is necessary. Freedom as insight into necessity.
And that's, well, so now we're constructing the necessity in it. So that then is part of the package. And this necessity you will hear beneath all of the new atheists and that's exactly why in some ways my address to them is so postmodern, because they're like, you must follow rationality. Why? Or what? There's no God who's going to come and punish me. You just keep debunking hell, right? You and I are headed for the same big sleep, right? Where's this necessity that you're placing upon me? You just took old Christian necessity and dressed it up different. You did the same thing as all of these preachers preaching hell. You just said, I arrive at this through reason. No. I can see what's going on outside my door. My church looks so abandoned. People are always shocked when I walk out the door. It's like C.S. Lewis's argument about pantheism. Anyway, continue.
Freedom as insight into what is your duty with absolute necessity, and then your capacity to follow through and on your own practice what is the moral law.
And so you see, actually, whereas a lot of us would be thinking freedom as freedom from, it's really more freedom to.
This, for Kant, and these are the notions number 3 and 4 that I'd like to point out, connected with this are maturity and control. So through this autonomy, through our own insight into the law, the moral law, and our capacity to understand the law rationally, we thereby also make, let's say, the informed decision to practice the law. And this shows that we have achieved maturity. So,
and okay, so now you have a telos. And look at what the telos is. I mean, maturity is a telotic idea, that this is the fullness of agency, the fullness of a developmental pathway and control. This is again what we have here are the foundation stones of modernity and liberalism in the technical historical sense, not the political sense.
So we can guide ourselves. We are no longer dependent on the guidance of others, and this guidance comes from what we could call intellectual or rational maturity. So the mature being is the fully rational being that is then capable of exercising, and here we get to the fourth.
And of course, this, in terms of our social context, is going to very much determine our status hierarchies. Well, they're clearly not mature and in control and thinking rationally like I do. Watch Dallas Willard's Veritas Forum video on worldview transmission. So much of this is communicated and reinforced via social hierarchies.
Concept, self-control. So we are fully in control of ourselves.
Now, I can't listen to this and also not think of the Apostle Paul for the fruits of the Spirit, the fruit of the Spirit, not fruits, singular, fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control, from the book of Galatians. There is in some ways in modernity. So I've just sort of said, wow, look at the relationship between modernity and the rebellion in the garden. Genesis 3. Look at the relationship between modernity and the life, the fullness of Christian life, where, a la C.S. Lewis, Screw Tape Letters, Christ raises us up to be like him. So you've also got sort of a theosis happening here, where we are made in the image of God, and part of what's supposed to happen in our journey on earth is we are supposed to grow into Christ. And so there's a destination there in Christian theology. Now, I should mention that a number of people all along the way have noted that HG here is a Taoist. So those of you who are out there saying, well, you Christian pastor finding a Christian philosopher to gin up Immanuel Kant. Kant is Prussian. He's deeply embedded in Christianity. Germany, probably, before one of the most Christian nations in the world, the epicenter of so much Western civilization, theological, philosophical, scientific. Pay attention to Germany before the two world wars. It took two wars basically to take down Germany, and some in Europe are continuing to be. Well, Germany, the EU is now just the new German Empire, and that's why the Brits are like, no, thank you, let's leave. And the French, well, I don't know what the French are thinking. Germany finally has had its way with France, perhaps. I don't know. I don't know anything about European politics. Y'all can fight about that yourself. But, it'd be nice in just sort of a dualistic way to say, oh, yeah, modernity bad. No. Also, modernity good. Deeply Christian influence in the Enlightenment. And so these four Enlightenment values, you can find them in some ways anticipated by the Apostle Paul.
Right, and this is the end goal of enlightenment, to be fully in control of ourselves rather than being controlled in some form of unconscious manner by some forces that lie outside of our own rationality.
Spiritual forces? Paul would say that. And then Paul's transition with the law, the Mosaic Code. And see, in some ways, we're still wrestling, as Luther is, and as Calvin does, with, well, shoot, I've been preaching about circumcision. If they're not going to follow the Mosaic Code, are they going to act like Greeks? And by Greeks, they mean citizens of the Roman Empire and the Eastern Empire in the first century, and all of the kind of, because Galatians, Paul's going to have a list of bad things contrasting. So the works of the flesh are all of these things. The works of the Spirit, the fruit of the Spirit is this: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control, which, again, wouldn't come as any surprise to anyone who was sort of up on observations about what a virtuous life would look like, perhaps under Stoicism in some respects, or we know that there were plenty of lists of virtues in the Roman world.
To illustrate the absolute necessity of the moral law, which is, of course, a consequence of its absolute rationality, I'd like to point to a famous and somewhat infamous essay Kant wrote towards the end of his life. The essay is called "On a Supposed Right to Tell Lies from Benevolent Motives." In this essay, Kant insists that what he already made very clear in the Critique of Practical Reasons and in the Metaphysics of Morals, that moral laws, just like natural laws, do not tolerate exceptions. So here he gives the example of, let's say, white lies, right? And he says, for no reason is lying acceptable. And he gives an extreme example, the example of someone coming with an axe to someone else's house and asking if a certain person is in that house because he wants to kill that.
This question. Oh, sounds like coffee break's over. I'll be back a little bit. I was going to say this question bothered Christian Reformed people who... I got to go deal with it. There's a church down the street that offers COVID testing. And so people come in here all masked up, and it's like, is this where you have the COVID testing? It's like, nope, don't breathe on me. You're looking for a COVID test. Oh.
That person with his ex. And even in a situation like this, when you're opening the door and you see the person with the X coming.
Yeah, so the Dutch CRC version of this was all about, would you lie to a Nazi?
And the person asks you if the person he wants to kill is inside the house. Even then, you're not supposed to lie. Even then, lying is wrong. You might do other things, but you cannot lie. So Kant says, otherwise it wouldn't be a law. The violation of the universal moral law is more severe than the violation of certain specific individual interests, right?
Now, what's interesting when I listen to this, when I've got the Rationality Rules video in line, is because in some ways he's talking as if Christians do this. And you can, of course, find some Christians who sort of do this. That gets into an entire debate after the Protestant Reformation about, Jesuits who seem to find the great flexibility to, the Jesuits were known for their rather situational ethics in the post-Reformation period. Citation, the book Reformations. So, and some Protestant fundamentalists could get really rigid, but I've never met a Christian that's as rigid as this. And so it's sort of funny watching someone argue from rationality and have a position like this, which is so enormously rigid. And in fact, it's so rigid, it's difficult to live with. And you find, at least in the biblical canon, for those who know it well, well, why is it okay for David to eat the showbread when he's running away from Saul? This is a standard talking point in the Bible about, trying to, the way that the Bible gets at questions of ethics through narrative is different. And it's not just relativism, but it's not this kind of Kantian legalism. It's much more nuanced.
It's not a consideration of utility. It's not a consideration of emotional inclination. It's a moral law. And because it's a moral law, its violation is unacceptable. Interestingly enough, as actually one viewer remarked on the previous video on Kant, Kant at the same time was also very much a racist. By the way, not only racist, he was also homophobic, sexist, and you can find out many other things where he totally violated what we would nowadays consider as general basics of moral decency. Just to
okay, so. And I'm not criticizing HG here, but what's amazing, and this is where I get into the registers, if you're going to have a moral system, just having a moral system initiates the upper register of heaven, spirit, mind, eternality, timelessness, constancy, law. What's interesting that when Kant, look at the way this kind of, got both pictures, it's got a little blend here in his video construction. When Kant talks about law as in, let's say, a law of physics, that's really a different use of the word than the speed limit or legislation. And that's what Lewis tries to get at when he says something of, this kind of language makes citizens of atoms. What are we talking about with this word? So, it's interesting how, and this again is almost part and parcel of, well, any book like I Imagine How You Use It, Christians, me speaking as an atheist, would have timeless truths. And now, fair enough to the new atheists and the celebrity atheists, because Christians talk this way all the time. What they struggle to understand is that a lot of that talk is sort of born out of the political infighting within the church, often between modernists and fundamentalists, between change and no change. And so they sort of sound like Aristotle when they say God who doesn't change. But Aristotle's God who doesn't change is a little different from the God that we find in the book of Jonah, who, in at least some old translations, repents of the evil he was about to do to Nineveh. Because the God, especially the God number two that you find, the God number two-ish God of the Bible, hears prayer and relents. And that's exactly the thing that the dynamic that that Sam Harris will simply scoff at, because a God who hears prayer and responds. This is exactly what we may not have in modernism.
Name 4 moral judgments that he presented in the Metaphysics of Morals, which, like all his moral judgments, are supposed to be grounded in the universal moral law, and therefore are supposed to be valid with absolute necessity. So,
and not only with absolute necessity, but again, if you go back to a slide before, it has to be universal. In other words, this is always a law, just like gravitational constant. It's always a law. It's always wrong to lie. It's always wrong to steal. And there are no gray areas about David saying, well, Saul sent us on this errand and we really need something to eat. Can we have the bread from the table of showbread, please, even though that's supposed to be only eaten by the priests? And of course, in the Bible, well, then, even though David is, prophet, priest, and king, you definitely have sort of these three offices, even in the Old Testament, which in some ways relates to executive, legislative, judicial. But in the king, they're sort of all in one. But they're always, when the Bible is always working on, well, should the king act like a priest? And the prophets should the king act like a prophet? Well, Saul is with the prophets. So there's all this ambiguity built into the scriptures that the long conversation within the people of the book are wrestling with and trying to figure out what law comes out of this and how these things impact the law. But obviously in Kant's world, law is this iron fixed thing. And so even if you say, well, I'm a moral relativist, you'd better not charge anyone else with being wrong. You lose that privileged position of accusation, hasatan. You lose that privileged position of accusation once you basically declare that it's all relative.
Number one, he said homosexuality is absolutely intolerable. Like having sex, having homosexual sex is basically animalistic. It's like having sex with animals, and it is absolutely intolerable. Secondly, all these examples again are from the metaphysics of morals. If you have a servant and the servant runs away, then you can by force make the servant return, because as Kant says, the master's right to a servant is like his right to a thing that he owns. And two more.
This is the guy who said, don't use people as means. It's like, wow.
Kantian moral pronouncements. One, he was very fond of the death penalty. He thought the death penalty ought to be applied in any case of murder. And he gave one example, a thought experiment, where he said, look, if there's an island and the island have a number of prisoners on death row, and for whatever reason the people on the island decide to leave the island, it is their moral duty, their absolute necessity, before they leave, to first execute all the people on death row. They can't even leave them back on the island. And a fourth example, a final, he said there is one form of killing that shouldn't be considered murder, and that is the killing of illegitimate children, who are born out of wedlock. And he said killing such children is actually not really murder, because, and he uses this analogy, these children have been smuggled into the Commonwealth or into society like contraband is smuggled into the economy. That is, by illegal means they have entered society, and therefore, as he says, their annihilation, just like you destroy contraband, cannot be considered murder.
And you thought you were saying Kant was a bad guy because he was a racist or something. He's killing babies.
These four examples, and particularly the final two examples, the example with the prisoners who have to be executed and the illegitimate children whose killing is murder, reveal what I think is a basic moral paradox. Not only in Kant's philosophy, but in many variations of moral philosophy. What we see in Kant, the form the paradox takes on in Kant is that he states that all his moral considerations are grounded in pure reason, therefore are not historically or culturally relative. However, it is very clear, that's why I gave just these four examples, that in actuality they very much reflect Kant's own cultural and social prejudices, cultural and social prejudices of his time with regard, for instance, to so-called illegitimate children, and also a certain psychology and a certain emotionality, like homophobia has also the word phobia in it, and Nietzsche very much engaged in such a psychological analysis of Kant's moral philosophy, where you can see, and this is the paradox, that precisely such a moral philosophy, which aims at eliminating social and historical and cultural contingencies and psychological and emotional components, at the same time reveals itself to be highly informed precisely by such cultural and social contingencies, by such a cultural and social background, and by a certain psychology and a certain emotionality that comes along with it.
Now, we've just watched Nietzsche explain Kant via processes. In other words, Nietzsche's modern too. Nietzsche, I certainly am not subject to these things. I'm autonomous, but Kant, he's just a product of his age.
Paradox is that while philosophy, moral philosophy, tries to rationally cleanse morality, in the very same act, it shows the impossibility of such cleansing. So, interestingly enough, I think Kant's moral philosophy very much contradicts one of his basic aims in his critique of pure reason, namely to eliminate dogmatism. I think Kant's moral philosophy is very much a form of moral dogmatism. Here he makes philosophy something like the handmaiden of a secularized Christian mainstream morality. He provides supposedly scientific metaphysical groundings for the prejudices of his time.
Now, this business about dogmatism is a big deal, and one of the candidates for video I wanted to do this week was Words That Fudge, to bring that old series back, dogmatism. And I might, because again, he does a nice treatment of dogmatism in a subsequent video. But so how does that map on sort of to my two-register metaphor that I'm working here? Well, dogmatism basically is you can't show your work because it's coming from the upper register. And what we want is we want to be able to show your work down here all below in the lower register. So then we'll all agree. But if it's coming from the upper register, and so of course then new atheists, celebrity atheists would say, oh, dogmatism, because that's all Christian smuggling in stuff from the upper register, and we don't agree with anything in the upper register except that you can't live without invoking the upper register one way or another, and Kant is a prime example of it. You are going to create something. You're going to put something up in the heavenlies, whether you understand it or not, because that's what morality and all of these visions are. That's the only place they can be located. You put them in eternality. Otherwise, if you remove the upper register at all, then you are basically everything down here is subject to decay, subject to revision, completely at the mercy of every context. And well, then we're just sort of in sophistry. And then you lose any ability to, with integrity, to stand up and say, thou ought not, thou shalt not, you should not, you're bad, my way is better. Then you lose all value.
I think that is a danger, at least a danger, that philosophy also faces today, both on the right and on the left with regard to wokeism. That philosophy, particularly academic moral philosophy, unfortunately has a certain tendency to justify certain social, cultural biases and is informed by certain emotional and psychological, let's say, tendencies, while engaging in some form of philosophical discourse that rationalizes certain prejudices of our times. So while moral philosophy intends to eliminate social and psychological contingencies, it typically still reflects precisely these contingencies in the moral norms that it proclaims. This general paradox of moral philosophy can be further analyzed, I think, into three kinds of moral pathologies. And again, we take Kant's moral philosophy as an example of this.
Now, this part of the video I found very interesting because we're talking about them as moral pathologies. Well, where does that word come from? Well, I have one of my best friends in junior high and a little bit of high school until he went to a different school, is now an MD, and he's a pathologist. What is just walking around saying what's pathological? No, he gets, you go into the doctor and they do a biopsy and they send it to my friend. He's a pathologist. He goes in and he says which cells are healthy and which cells are cancerous or unhealthy. So what we're doing here is we're going to talk about pathologies, but in order to pathologize something, to turn it into an agentic frame, in order to at least label some things as pathological, you must have the idea that something is healthy. And again, what we've sort of done in a therapeutic culture is tried to get around making value statements by smuggling in other value statements in registers that sound biological, like health. And I've watched this in church work. I've watched this in society in general. No, we have to do this is not about religion. This is about what's healthy. Oh, you've just smuggled in whole realms of values under the guise of biology. And now what we're sort of trying to do when we smuggle in values via biology is we are using this dead reckoning within the iron box of secularism to try to encounter values in the lower register without getting them from above. That's awfully tough. But I think in many ways, that's the hope of a civilization that has basically lost its ability to listen to anything from above, because that's all that we're left with. And there's, that's in some ways a function of the great American experiment where we said, okay, we're going to, there's all classicists who founded the United States. We're going to found the United States on things like virtue. No values, no religiously sourced values in there, even though, of course, just like Kant and how many others of his day, you simply do not have a moral discernment clean room, which is exactly what Kant was trying to do in his attempt to gain this from, and let's use the word, pure reason. So it's no time to you, but it's an hour and a half to me, and I have to get back on track here. It's part of the reason I do these videos the way I do.
The first moral pathology is what I would call the philosophical pathology. So the philosophical pathology consists in what we could maybe call an extreme moralist reductionism. Take the illegitimate child case as an example, right? The production of a child out of wedlock is a very complex, concrete act. It involves human passions, it involves emotions, it involves sexual desires,
It's a great example of the two registers and knitting them together. Because down in the lower register, it's the biological act of reproduction. The upper register, there's marriage. Well, marriage, you've introduced psychology, the social level, the spiritual invasion of reproduction. That might be a good way to say it.
It involves relationships. It involves, of course, social and cultural norms and so forth. So it's a very complex act. But if then we reduce this act under the category illegitimate child, we redescribe this act as a moral phenomenon.
And reduction is exactly the right word because, again, with the two registers, a lot of what people want to do is eliminate the top register and say, well, it's just the lower register. And all of these intrusive ideas such as marriage and illegitimacy and commitment and all of those should be off the table. They never will be.
This moral judgment, illegitimate child, basically erases the whole complexity of the existence of this human being. So it's an extreme simplification, a moralistic reinterpretation of human life. And a moralistic reinterpretation in terms of this supposed higher principle, of this supposed higher moral law. But this supposed moral law or supposed higher principle is not at all similar to the natural laws that it is supposed to be similar to.
And you can therefore see sort of the upper register at that point. This is not really coming from below. This is really coming from above. This is much more emanation rather than emergence.
It is not the case that the principle that makes an illegitimate child illegitimate relates to the very existence of this child.
In other words, if you did, let's say Kant has his way and the child is killed, you can't do an autopsy on the child and compare it, let's say, to a legitimate child who tragically dies. You can't do an autopsy and find the illegitimacy or the legitimacy in either child within the lower register.
In the same way as a natural law, let's say, explaining the motion of the stars in the sky relates to this motion in the stars. So it's a kind of an absurd reinterpretation of a fact that is in itself amoral in moral terms. And I think that's, again, the philosophical pathology of moral philosophy, that it subsumes certain acts to supposed moral laws, which in fact have no specific relation to the case that they are supposed to explain and to judge.
And so in many ways we're again knocking at the door of Wilfrid Sellars and normativity, as Daniel Bonavac points out, and another philosophical YouTuber, another professor of philosophy at University of Texas in Austin.
And to impose a certain value on. The second pathology is what I would like to call the social pathology.
The difficulty that you have is that if you label these as pathologies, there's value all over it. So a child dies. A large male terminates the life of an infant. Let's try to, as best as we can, strip all the value statements out of the act. So baby killing, no moral judgments. There we have it. We're not going to get away in the manifest image from value judgments.
Of moral philosophy. That's the dogmatism that I spoke about earlier. The creation of a fundamentalist language, the communication of supposedly no longer questionable.
Now the question of fundamentalism and the choice of that word is very interesting, and I don't think we have, as if I don't have time. This is YouTube. We have all the time in the world, but I don't have time in my life at this moment. But the use of this term fundamentalism is a very interesting one. And we, it's useful, and I don't think it's illegitimate in terms of its use, and we know what it's communicating, but one could do a decent autopsy on that word as well. And because in fact what he's pointing out with these pathologies is that Kant is, this will lead to a certain fundamentalism, and we don't want that fundamentalism because we have an intuition already that there needs to be strength and flex in a good moral system. We see that all the time. There needs to be norms, there needs to be give and take, and that's That's what we know we need in a good moral system. And the source of our difficulty in constructing this and dealing with it in language as opposed to practice, because, language is, of course, a tremendously powerful compression algorithm, but not as deep, not as profound a compression algorithm as action. Action is even more profound of a compression algorithm, because with action, you have both the upper register and the lower register, and language itself is located in the upper register.
Self-evident moral claims. And we have this, of course, not just in philosophy, we have it much stronger, perhaps even in religion. Now we have it very much also in media, in the social media. We have it in politics. We even have it in art. So the social pathology of morality is the communication of fundamentalist dogmatic moral language that doesn't allow for further questioning. And that's what the categorical imperative stands for, right? It is categorical, right? So the introduction of a certain...
In other words, the categorical is, of course, upper register rather than lower.
Categorical language into society, into specific forms of communication, I think has highly pathological tendencies. So this very manner of categorical speech points to the social pathology of morality. And then the third and final pathology I'd like to address, which is closely related to the first and second one, is the psychological pathology. It's a pathology of thinking. It's a kind of obsessive, compulsory insistence on moral principles. Like, again, think back to the example of the death row prisoners, right? Where we're supposed to feel this obsessive compulsion to, first kill all these death row inmates before leaving an island. So it's a kind of a moralist zeal, a moral frenzy, which, again, you see today in wokeism. Kant's moral philosophy, especially with respect to the example of the killing of illegitimate children and his insistence on death penalty, deserves, I think, a label that Nietzsche coined for Christian ethics. He called it the metaphysics of the hangman in The Twilight of the Idols. And I think Kant is very much a secular version of this, and very literally in the metaphysics of...
So much of this is examining the language that because buzzwords are holy words. What do I mean by that? Buzzwords are holy words. Buzzwords almost always tip us into the upper register. And so it's a secular version. Well, what does that mean? Well, again, a la Tom Holland, understanding of secularity as the secret sister of the church. So we're going to take God number 2 out, and we're going to cover over God number 1 and call it deism and things like that. And we are going to take personal agency out of it, but we're going to have all the same functional things happening in terms of a dogmatism and a moral framework that, well, then you have to simply ask, is this moral framework an improvement over the old religious one? And, well, we wanted an improved moral framework because, but suddenly we find ourselves with a dogmatism that is far more strict than anything that you can find in the Mosaic Code, because the Mosaic Code is of course given along with a whole lot of narrative, and in that narrative you'll have the kind of moral flexibility that we struggle to communicate. Law is really a very rigid thing. Narrative can often provide a much more supple, flexible, fleshy normativity than law can. And law is almost always mediated by a judge, and it's the judge that brings into the application of the law a far more nuanced, complex application than you can find in just static law itself.
Morals, he describes the metaphysics of the hangman. Interestingly enough, Kant's been very influential for philosophy of law, philosophy of punishment based on retribution. Clearly, Kant's idea of justice, of legal justice, is to a large extent based on the idea of retribution. As Nietzsche already showed with regard to Christianity, this emphasis on retribution works in such a way that it ascribes individual guilt. It personalizes guilt. And on the basis of this personalization of guilt,
personalization is a critical word in here because somehow we need to get back. So again, I've had the upper and the lower register. Now you have the manifest and the scientific image. The scientific has to be reapplied into the manifest image through personalization.
Asks for guilt. And on the basis of this personalization of guilt, demands violence. It asks to repay the violence of the offender, for which the offender is made personally responsible, to be in return given to him. So symbolical violence or physical violence is explicitly not only justified, but actually becomes a moral necessity into this metaphysics of the hangman.
I think I can guess what camera he has. But Sony, get a Sony camera, get a Sigma 16 lens, good fast lens, quite reasonably priced. Get that focus in fast and sharp.
That you find in Kant, and I think that via Nietzsche we can understand as a form of a secularization of a morality that we also find in Christianity. Of course, in Christianity we also find an emphasis on forgiveness, but interestingly enough, in the practice of Christianity, this forgiveness is often, so to speak, sidelined by an insistence on retribution here in this world, and then forgiveness is left to God in the other world.
And it's for this reason that whenever I hear a description like that, I always think I need to be more careful when I talk about other religious traditions, because I can understand looking in from the outside. I can understand as an adult, perhaps looking back at Christianity through the eyes of a child. Via the memory, you sort of go back. I understand looking at selective cases. As a pastor, helping people practice forgiveness is a major part of one's job in maintaining a community. Because without forgiveness, community is impossible in this world.
So this retributive justice, which we can find at least in applied Christianity throughout history, where there's a strong emphasis on punishment, and Foucault also wrote about that later, and where we have, like, similarly still in the United States today, right? There's a large part of the...
It's just interesting, and I mean, I do this too. It's just like, and Foucault, oh my, well, there he is. Not a lot to say about him, but Foucault, we're going to understand Christianity through Foucault. Okay.
The population in the United States is still very much in favor of the death penalty. And as I understand it, at least, this pro-death penalty attitude is especially strong in the hardcore Christian communities.
Hardcore Christian? Is that like hardcore pornography? It's hardcore history? Am I a hardcore Christian?
In the evangelical communities, at least.
Oh!
There we see this insistence on retributive justice, and we find this equally in Kant. Now, I think actually this insistence on retribution, this metaphysics of the hangman, is not only very influential in American death penalty philosophy and on the American right and in American...
Now, from what I know, he's in Macau. Macau is an interesting place. I don't know much about it. Portuguese colony, one of these Chinese cities. Death penalties. China.
Evangelical Christianity. But it also informs the left, and it also informs social justice movement, and it also informs wokeism. There too, we have this kind of a hyper-moralism asking for punishment. And that's one reason why I disagree strongly with one of the books that was recommended by one of the viewers to me. The book is called Cynical Theories. This book explains wokeism.
Wait a minute. Oh, we've got crossover. We've got the hoaxers. And my conversation with James Lindsay continues to be a video that is one of the older videos that is regularly watched. And see, again, I really like Hans HG. I don't know. I got to figure out what to call him. Maybe we'll do a conversation and I'll figure out how to say his name right. At least Mathieu Pajot. See, Jonathan was easy. Jordan Peterson, that was simple. John Vervaeke. Well, that's that Dutch thing. I can say a name like Vervaeke. That's almost, it's not Dutch. It's Belgian, but so and I really like this because he's outside. He's not American, and so he can give his critiques of American politics. He's outside of Christianity, so he can give his critique about Christianity, and he's outside this whole realm. Which, okay, new information. Let's have it.
Book is called Cynical Theories. This book explains wokeism more or less solely as a consequence of basically European postmodernism. And I think that's an extreme reduction. I think the wokeism that we see now on the so-called left in the United States, and that has increasingly global influence, and that I personally regard as very problematic, is equally influenced by this kind of metaphysics of the hangman, a certain post-Kantian insistence on retributive justice. And
now that's so interesting because it's not just post-modernity. Now you have to understand that in their career before they were hoaxers, James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose and Peter Boghossian were online new atheists. And now none of them, if you ask them, because I have, none of them are very interested in talking about, all the way back to the beginning of this video, in case you remember, about basically new atheism losing its interest in debunking Christianity. So, well, hey, we still got Rationality rules around. He's still liking to do it. So, but it's very interesting how, well, we're going to blame this on postmodernity because, again, well, especially the anti-woke new atheists, they want to preserve the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is in a sense, their Reformation story. So if you grew up like I did in the Christian Reformed Church, and again, I love to point out this book, which was written in the 60s, you sort of, here's a church. I mean, you can just follow, here's the temple, Moses and sheep. This is a book for, catechizing young people. We'll have some biblical stories. The church in the Old Testament. Oh, sorry, Jacob. This book is going to offend. The Holy Spirit in the church. So you sort of have, in Christian Reformity, you have Moses, and then you've got Paul, and here we have a nice youth being catechized right here. And, we got missionaries. We got to get through the New Testament. Lots of New Testament stuff, of course. And then one Holy Catholic Church. Make sure that's a small c, not one Roman Catholic Church. The blood of the martyrs. So you got Stephen. He's the best martyr. the church falls into sin shortly after the year 300. This is the standard Protestant way of doing it. Shortly after the year 300, all persecution stopped. God stopped it in a surprising way. And then you have Constantine, but very quickly Constantine gets forgotten, and we're surely not going to go by Constantinople or any of that stuff. And we've got some Christian missionaries evangelizing the genetic ancestors of my people, wearing, the Dutchman. But then, before you know it, I mean, the Middle Ages just is gone in a blink, and God reforms his church. So you've got 2 pages for Constantine out, and then of course you've got Luther, here I stand, I can do no other, and then little nod to Zwingli, but don't ask him about the Lord's Supper. And before you know it, we've got Calvin. Calvin, and that's the way we then we have Calvinist churches. So that's the way we tell the story. So for the new atheists, it's the Enlightenment, and Foucault losing the Enlightenment. But from HG here, you're going to get a little bit more of a nuanced story.
This was very clear, very obvious only just a few weeks ago at the Derek Chauvin trial, where we saw, particularly on the left, a very strong demand, an outcry for punishment, and an ecstasy of punishment, and a media frenzy about just indignation. And I think there is a straight line from this, precisely not to postmodernism, but to the metaphysics of the hangman that we find in Kant, and that in turn has its root in European Christianity. So much for today.
So, happy me. More videos to watch. As if y'all weren't still making videos, and you got Grim Grizz, and you got Mark, and you got Vervaeke, of course, makes tons of videos, and you got Peugeot, and Jordan Peterson still makes. I'm still waiting. I'm kind of waiting for the Peterson, Vervaeke, Peugeot, Bishop Barron video. That's the big one coming up at some point. So anyway, super excited about this new YouTuber, at least new to me. Super excited about his content, and all of this is putting us towards what he really wants to talk about, which is identity, profiles, personhood in this new electronic mediated age of screens. And I'm really excited to get into that. But before we do that, we got to do our homework, and we've got to look at Kant. At least got a nice video out there. You've got Hegel and Marx and Nietzsche. So he's got a ton of videos out there and they're quite reasonably short, unlike this video, unlike my video. So, addressing a different audience. So yeah, let me know what you think. Leave a comment and celebrate with me.